Friends, colleagues, a warm welcome to tonight's event. My name is Ed Turner. I work at Aston University in Birmingham, based in the Aston Centre for Europe. And it's a huge pleasure to be chairing tonight's gathering with the Foreign Policy Centre, a leading think tank on foreign policy issues with whom we've had a long and very fruitful collaboration. I can only apologise that we're starting a little bit late. Birmingham is served by the very best of British infrastructure, but unfortunately it let us down tonight, and there have been other challenges of people getting here as well. As you'll have seen, John Healey, who was here, has had to run out to vote, but I'm quite sure that he'll be back soon. And in any case, the introductory remarks that I would make are definitely not something he needs to hear. Just a word on housekeeping. I think the thought is to record this event. A number of people have had to pull out at the last minute from attending because they had a cold. There's quite a lot of it going around, unfortunately. So if that's okay, that would be good. I'm sure if someone's asking a question or making a comment and they want that to be stopped, then we can make a note of that, and Poppy, who's over there from the Foreign Policy Centre, will make sure that then doesn't appear. So tonight's discussion, coinciding with Nils' visit to London, and Nils, you're very, very warmly welcome here, is about how to keep Europe safe and cooperation between the UK, Germany and beyond. Maybe I'll start with just the substantive reasons why we were so keen to pull this together. I mean, the backdrop, and it's a terrible thing, is war in Europe again, and I think that was our very troubling starting point. Attacks on Ukraine's critical infrastructure, wider threats, even the horrors of nuclear threats coming from Russia, and of course also unconventional attacks already actually affecting us in the form of cyber warfare. Germany's been on a really important journey, I think, which we recognise here in the United Kingdom. In German, going under the name Zeitenwende here, watershed moments, turning points in its foreign policy. And I think certainly from where we're sat, making such a brave and substantial change to the course of post-war foreign policy is really worthy of recognition and note. That change has involved, of course, exporting heavy weapons to Ukraine. It's involved committing a fund of 100 billion euros anchored in the German Basic Law. And it's rethought the role of Russia in Europe and the role of Russia and Germany's relationship with Russia. And of course also there's been a significant price to pay in Germany as across Europe in weaning itself off from Russian sources of energy. Here in the United Kingdom, of course, the government has also, and the Labour Party, working side by side with the government on this, trying to minimise party political division, has stood by side with Ukraine as well. I think when John comes, it would be interesting to explore with him the extent to which government rhetorical commitment to Ukraine has necessarily been backed always by investment, but that's something which we'll be able to explore. And together, of course, we've also just been through a really bruising phase in relations between the United Kingdom and the European Union, and of course within that it's been a really complicated, difficult time in relations between the United Kingdom and Germany. But now at that moment of war in Europe, it seemed to us that it would be a really, really important time to pull things together and to reflect on what we can do as believers in the rule of law, believers in global justice. Also, and the speakers on this platform share a social democratic commitment, so also look at some of the underlying factors which threaten European and global security. Pulling all of those things together and thinking very practically, what can we do as we come out of that very bruising period? What are the obstacles to that cooperation? How can we change it? And of course, also people will know it's an interesting time in British politics at the moment. Who knows? Maybe political alliances in the UK will shift. There are three people speaking with us tonight. Just a few words of introduction. John Healey, who will be joining us. But I see there's a second division, so we'll reshuffle the order a little bit, if that's all right. Kathy, I'll turn to you and then to Nils. John Healey is the MP for Wentworth and Dearn, which he's been since 1997. In fact, his background was more in domestic political topics, so a Treasury Minister, Housing and Planning Minister, and then for a long time Shadow Secretary of State for Housing. But he moved to the Defence Brief in 2020, and was, I think, responsible and given the task restoring Labour's credibility on security issues. It's terrific to have Baroness Catherine Ashton with us tonight. Someone that started her political career, initially and also on the domestic scene, was the Minister for Sure Start, terrifically lamented by those of us with young children. Then moving on, becoming Peer of the Year, becoming Labour's leader in the House of Lords, and indeed, if I'm not mistaken, shepherding the Lisbon Treaty through the House of Lords as well. Took over from Lord Mandelston as Trade Commissioner, then became the UK's first High Representative on Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, and led to the interim nuclear deal with Iran, as well as an agreement between Serbia and Kosovo, amongst a long list of achievements. And I was also very struck, reminding myself of things that Cathy had done, that when she went to Iran, she also met with women's groups there. And I think in the light of the current situation, that very forward-thinking and strong, brave move is really something, which we ought to acknowledge. So it's really brilliant to have your first-hand insights on this topic. Then lastly, the third member of our panel is Nils Schmid. Nils is a distinguished parliamentarian who, in fact, like many distinguished German national politicians, started off with a really serious role in regional politics. Nils was the Deputy Minister-President of Baden-Württemberg in the southwest of Germany, was Minister of Finance there. He was elected to the Bundestag, the German parliament, in 2017 and became in 2018 the SPD's foreign policy spokesperson. He's played an exceptional role, I think I can say, in developing the SPD's position at this most challenging time of the turning point with the war in Ukraine. And also, people may be interested, Nils has met with John on a number of occasions and is someone who's really committed to the relationship with the United Kingdom. So it's brilliant to have this panel here. It'll be even better when John returns from voting on the Financial Services and Markets Bill. Speakers have been asked to speak for up to sort of 5 to 7 minutes. We've got plenty of time for questions and answers. And Cathy, if you're happy to take the floor first, that will be absolutely brilliant.
Thanks, Ed. It's lovely to see everybody. I'm sorry that, you know what it's like here, the bells go off, and I think there's going to be a vote in the Lords, which I don't have to go to, but it'll be another bell going off, so apologies for that. But it's great to be here, and it's great to have a chance to talk with all of you. So for me, getting to the point where we have a conversation is always the best part. I wanted to start with making an obvious observation. There is no issue that we face as a country that we can resolve alone. No. If you think about the obvious, from climate change to pandemic, and then think about how you deal with economic challenges right the way through to counter-terrorism, support for allies, working closely with others, whatever you choose as an issue, you will find that you have to do it with someone else. And if you start from that principle, that there is nothing we can do to make our country as good and great as it can be without working in collaboration with someone else, then you start to define and establish what it is that you're going to do and with whom. And the second obvious point is that you work closest with those with whom you share common values. As the first EU High Representative, I worked with 28 nations who signed up to a shared view of the future of Europe at that point, but also signed up to believing in the same things: democracy, freedom, human rights, the rule of law, the values that we hold dear and believe in. We have other allies. The United States is the most obvious big example of that. But there were fundamental ways and reasons that you work with those with whom you share those values and ideals. So we can't do things on our own, and we work and should work with those with whom we share the values that we hold dear. And that means we need to develop partnerships of different kinds to support our security and support our prosperity. And that is an obvious point to make, but in the context of now trying to establish what those relationships will look like with our European allies, it's really important that we stick to the basic principles that we hold dear. With our colleagues in Germany, for example, on foreign policy, one of the areas that we work closest with on is the Western Balkans, an area that I know well and an area that I've done mediation and negotiation in. But this is an area where common foreign policy is aligned between us, as it is in fact aligned across Europe. So finding not only the principles, but also the practical application of those principles in terms of the kind of work that we do is really significant as well. It means that we need to think about the collaborative projects for the future all the time, and it's especially true, and if John were here, and when he comes back, he will talk particularly from a defence portfolio. But if I just talk about that briefly in a European context, it's about how does Britain relate to not just its continuing work within NATO, but also the relationship between NATO and the European Union. And this is an important relationship because it has many synergies, many approaches where the two combine to try and provide the most effective defence and security. I'll give you just two examples from my own time in office. The European Defence Agency worked on the improvised explosive devices in terms of research and development, finding out who made them, how they were made, how to identify them, what to do was hugely important for troops from Britain and from Europe and from the United States in the context of what they were doing in various theatres across the world. Equally, in practical training, for example, in those times, only a few countries in Europe knew how to do mid-air refuelling between planes. The reason being that if you look at the geography of Europe, they tended to go up and come back down. They didn't do long flights. But when they were in theatre, they needed to have that capacity. And that meant training programs for pilots, being able to support them in something as practical as that. Helicopter training for the theatre of Afghanistan over the years and so on. Lots of ways in which Europe and NATO collaborated together in defence and security. It also means, though, for this country, thinking about the participation in missions that operate beyond Britain. In other words, not just NATO missions, but also missions where the European Union is in the lead. When we were dealing and tackling with piracy off the coast of Somalia, for example, the EU mission, Atalanta, which was very successful at that time, despite Tom Hanks's Captain Phillips. Yeah. Nonetheless, that was a European Union mission that was run from Britain. It actually was run out of the NATO headquarters in Northwood, and then it moved over to Spain as we left the European Union. But an example of a collaborative mission which takes in not just countries within the European Union, but outside. So there were many countries, from Ukraine to South Korea, who participate in that mission. And we need to think, as we go forward, how does Britain relate to military security missions that are operating beyond its borders, where it wants to collaborate with not just NATO, but also with Europe as well. We also have to think about the cyber capabilities that we have, and I'm going to leave John to talk about some of the practical aspects of how he's thinking about that. But looking again at how we work collaboratively on security issues, we have to think about the role of Britain in collaboration on cybersecurity. Because, as you all know, cybersecurity attacks are on the increase. They don't just attack for defence reasons, they attack businesses, they attack to provide opportunities to economically damage countries, and they are pretty widespread, taking in not just one country at a time, but indeed right across the continent. And that means we need to think about how we collaborate on those issues as well. All of this is about the capacity to create security and prosperity for this country. And if I go back to what I said at the beginning, it's about the way in which we develop our economic and security approach to make sure that we offer the most opportunities for the country as a whole. And none of it, which is just to go back to what I said at the beginning, John, none of it can be done on our own.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much indeed, Kathy. So much to get into there. John, are you ready to go next? Sorry, we've just dragged you out of the division lobby. Sure. Would that work? Brilliant. Already introduced you, John. Great to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming tonight. A special thank you to Aston University and the Centre the Foreign Policy Centre for organising this. I do apologise that the votes have interrupted, but I have managed to get the whips to agree to let me off the next vote, so I'm glad to be able to stay with you and look forward to the comments and points in discussion, because there's probably much more expertise in the room than there is at the table here, so thank you for your time tonight. I'd have to say, look, this is a great pleasure for me. Cathy Ashton and Nils Schmid are the two of the people I most like and most respect in politics, so it's great to share this with you. Where to start? I think we're going to start with Ukraine, and the Ukrainians, military and civilians alike, have demonstrated huge bravery and skill and national resilience in their fight against the Russian invasion. That has been the first profound miscalculation that Putin has made. Beyond that, I remember in January this year when David Lammy and I visited Kyiv together. One of the former prime ministers of Ukraine said to us, Western unity is Ukraine's best defence. And when you look at the fact that NATO is stronger, closer to the Russian border, set to get larger, when you look at the fact that only 5 other nations supported Russia when the United Nations General Assembly debated and passed a motion on its annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions, when you look at the fact that 40 nations have contributed military assistance to Ukraine since February, then you have to say that was the second profound miscalculation from Vladimir Putin. And this is an opportunity, if I may, Nils, just through you, to say, from a British point of view, a thank you and a recognition of the SPD-led German government's actions, which have been quite remarkable, both to support Ukraine and to work to try and keep that Western unity intact. And in many respects, Germany sometimes, I don't think, gets sufficient credit for what you've done. It was just 3 days after Putin went into Ukraine that Scholz gave his Zeitenwende speech. Within a month, you had ordered 35 F-35s. You are, for the first time in decades, supplying military assistance into a country in which 2 states are at war. And you have heavily reinforced Lithuania and other NATO allies. And it was Germany that said to Poland, we will supply you with Patriot missile defense systems. After that, Russian missile about a fortnight ago landed in Poland. So really from us to you and your government, a recognition of the role you played, and thank you. In terms of trying to encourage a debate here, perhaps let me offer some reflections on 3 areas where I think there are... Is it easier if I stand up, or are you all right at the back there? Okay. I'm following Cathy's lead. I'm going to keep talking over the bill. It will stop soon. In 3 areas. The first is an area which has, as far as defence goes, the lowest political status, is often overlooked, and very often put in the too difficult to do box, which is military procurement. We are used to observations which the Public Accounts Committee in this House of Commons has said is a broken system which constantly wastes taxpayers' money. It is too costly, too complex, often delayed, inflexible. But fundamentally, we've had the luxury and the complacency of it being a peacetime procurement system. And we've overlooked the fundamental that when nations are under threat or forced to fight, their forces depend on the strength of their industry. And when you consider that it's only today that the MOD has managed to sign a contract for replacement NLAW anti-tank missiles. By the way, day 287 of the invasion, then you've got to say that this is a system which isn't just broken, it is entirely unfit for the purpose that we require it, which is to equip our forces to defend the country and those of our allies. So, whoever is the Defence Secretary after the next general election, those deep failings that have been exposed over the last 10 months must be fixed, and deep reform is needed. For Labour, there would be 3 or 4 main hallmarks of the steps that we think are required. The first is we would call in the NAO on day 1 and ask them to do an across-the-board audit of waste in the MOD. Secondly, within the first 100 days, we would apply a NATO test to the major defence projects and programmes to ensure that Britain is capable of fulfilling our NATO obligations in full. Third, we would work with allies, but also through NATO, to accelerate the response in rebuilding stockpiles, both to continue to support Ukraine, but also those needed by our own forces. And look to build on that to see an acceleration of more standard specification, stronger European industry and supply, a capacity to flex when fighting is required. And fourth, we would ensure that British defence investment is directed first towards British firms and British jobs, because that is a reinforcement of the British economy, but it's a reinforcement of British sovereignty at the same time. So I think there's action required for us as the UK, but also in concert with NATO allies on that front. The second recognition I draw from Ukraine is that we simply weren't prepared for this. We were unwilling to recognise not just that Putin may launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but we were unwilling to recognise the aggressive actions to which we were subject for some time before February this year in the West. What do I mean by that? Well, 2014, he took Crimea and large parts of the Donbass. From that point on, Ukraine was requesting military weapons and support, but those British NLAW anti-tank missiles, which have played such a vital part in Ukraine defending itself in this last year, the first UK deliveries, despite Ukraine asking for that sort of weaponry since 2015, were delivered in January this year, a matter of weeks before Putin went in. And we've responded magnificently in the crisis, and including on offering training to Ukrainian recruits. But if you look at the league table of countries that Britain's military was involved in military training in 2001, Ukraine came 25th. So in other words, we weren't prepared there. We've been warned about the position of London in particular and Britain as the laundering dirty Russian money. It was 2016 when our government finally said it would act to ensure that there was a transparent register of land holdings in this country, so who owned what was clear. Well, that was 6.5 years ago and 4 prime ministers ago, and we finally just got the legislation, but we're still working out how to put it in place. So we didn't deal with the Russian money. We weren't prepared for the threats to Ukraine. And in many ways, we simply haven't seen clearly enough soon enough the fact that Putin is really at war in an economic and hybrid war with the West alongside his military war in Ukraine. So it's no coincidence that in the year before he went into Ukraine, he cut by 50% the gas supplies to Europe, so that we were running down the stocks, we were weakened before we went in, and the price had already gone going up. So it seems to me that concerned about our security, we're used to the concept of defending countries at the borders and abroad. We've got to take defending our country at home as seriously. And one of the highlights for me in the current government in Britain's Global Britain Strategy, its integrated review 20 months ago, was the commitment and the recognition that a national resilience strategy was required. Well, 20 months on, we're still waiting for that, and we may get the review of the integrated review before we can get any sort of resilience strategy. So, top priority, on the back burner for too long, without sufficient recognition or political will to put it in place and level with the public. And for a Labour government, that isn't just a top priority, but there is more we can do, particularly through NATO, on our ability to deal with the cyber threat that Cathy was talking about, on the development and commissioning of new technologies, and also on democratic resilience. And I'd like to see NATO take that much more seriously as well. Thirdly and finally, perhaps to reflect on the point that Cathy finished with, which is, if we needed reminding, I think Ukraine and our experience of Ukraine reminds us, particularly in a country like Britain or Germany, that almost no country can do anything on its own. And that the primary importance of partnerships and alliances has been utterly reinforced by this experience. And in many ways, for me, this gives lie to the bombast that we saw in that integrated review, the Global Britain, which was essentially a go-it-alone Britain in the world. It's pulled us back. It's pulled us back and reminded us that our primary security obligations lie where the threats are greatest, which is in Europe, the North Atlantic and the Arctic, and our primary defence and security obligations lie within NATO. So that for a Labour government would be clear, and I hope we'll see that in the overhaul of the integrated review that the government has promised to publish early in the new year. The second thing is that we would fix, and I hope the government will recognise the flaws now, but the fact there's a sort of Europe-shaped hole in that integrated review. No section on Europe, a long document in which its authors could barely bring themselves even to mention the words European Union. That requires Britain, particularly learning from the circumstances now and the experience of the last 10 months, if we needed reminding that Britain needs to have greater cooperation and some sort of structured agreements on defence and security with the European Union. We need to rebuild our relationships with key European countries. And for us, as a potential Labour-led British government, we look in particular to Germany and the SPD-led government there. We look at two or three things. First, and this is work that Nils and I are doing together, we look first at the fact that in a way the German-British defence and security relationship is underdeveloped when you consider that Britain has a formal, substantial relationship with France, encapsulated in the Lancaster Agreement. Germany has a formal, substantial relationship captured in the Aachen Agreement, and we need to close that gap. There's a great deal we can do, particularly as a Scholz-Starmer agreement based on parties that have a long-standing, unshakable commitment to multilateralism, international institutions, both of us recognise the security threats that come from inequality, climate change, shortage of food, water, healthcare, alongside a recognition that about the imperative to invest in our armed forces and in defence for our own country and for our allies. And so that's an area I hope also that we could see reflect some of the Syrian experience, as well as the challenges I think that we've had to face over the last 10 months, because we've looked to the future. Britain can't stand alone. Britain can't go it alone. We need in particular to rebuild those relationships and alliances with those that are closest to us in Europe. And I hope that the sort of dialogue that Labour and the SPD are having can help point the way and be a foundation for that.
John, thank you very much indeed. That's a terrific offer. And Nils, we really look forward to hearing your response to that, those suggestions and your analysis of the wider piece. So thank you very much indeed again for joining us.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. I'm glad to be here, and I want to thank the organisers for holding this event, from Policy Centre, Aston University, and a special thanks to John for suggesting this event. Since, as you rightly mentioned, we've been working on how to bring UK and the EU and Germany closer together on security matters for some time. Before I dive into that subject, I want to start with a personal remark. When I listen to you, Catherine, I feel how huge the loss is for Europe and the European Union that was caused by Brexit, because what you told us about your work in the European Union demonstrates to us how large the contribution was that the UK used to make to the European Union, and there's a specific diplomatic record and experience that Great Britain can bring into European security debates, and hopefully we will find ways to tap this huge potential in the future in a much better way than it is currently the case. To start with, you mentioned at Zeitenwende. I want to convey to you the message that as an MP and German politician, I deeply feel that Zeitenwende has occurred, and that there is a turn, that we have entered a new era of European security with Russia's attack on Ukraine. And Scholz's speech just some days after the launch of the Russian aggression, and interestingly enough, it was the one and only major speech given by a leading politician after the start of the war. When he coined this term Zeitenwende, it very much resonated with what we felt when we were assembled in this special session of the Bundestag on a Sunday morning. Because for German society, but also for German decision makers, this is indeed a new and very different era we are in now. Europe has turned colder in every sense of the word. And for 30 years, we were very much used to emphasize the dialogue side of our relationship with Russia and the deterrence side of the dual track approach usually operated by NATO was very much pushed aside, at least in German foreign policy thinking and action. And for good reasons. I do not want to put that too much into doubt, because after all, after the end of the Cold War, we all believed and worked for bringing Russia and the former Soviet states, and especially Eastern Europe in a more general sense, to bring this part of Europe into a pan-European security structure, into NATO for many of these states, into the European Union. And after all, it was a great success story, except for Russia. But looking at the Baltic states, at Poland, Romania, and many Eastern European states, it worked. Well, we now have some issues with Hungary and Poland, but still, in a very broad sense, it worked quite well. And now we have to shift gear and to sort of adapt to new realities, and that means that we will engage more in deterrence and less in dialogue with Russia. Probably there is not much room for any dialogue with this Russian government, but still we are very much proud of having President Macron and Chancellor Scholz still having a sort of communication going on with Putin in the Kremlin, and just for giving him some ideas about what is the reality on the ground in Ukraine regarding his soldiers. But still, deterrence will be the main part of our interaction with Russia for the foreseeable future. So in the years and maybe decades to come, European security needs to be organized without Russia and against Russia to a certain extent. And the idea of including Russia in a big European security scheme will have to wait for a fundamental change of Russian foreign policy. As long as it is aggressive and imperialist, it will be very difficult to bring back Russia into the remit of the OSCE or any other pan-European security structure. And that is very clear for us in Berlin, and it has also become very clear to German society. But there is still a gap between expectations from Germany and the understanding of Germany's role in the world and in Europe by our constituents. So all eyes are on us, especially Ukrainians' eyes, and I can tell you they count much more on Germany than on any other European nation. This is very new to the average German citizen, to be confronted with this high level of expectations. And what we are trying to do, and what the Chancellor is trying to do, is to come up to to fulfill these expectations, but at the same time building support back home for Germany playing a more prominent, some say a leading role in European politics, because we have seen generations of Germans being rather worried about Germany having a leading role, and now we have friends all around us telling us, hey, look, you should do more. Very unusual, and for many Germans still very strange. So it's a sort of overwhelming love that we are feeling from our friends, and we are not too much prepared for that, mentally speaking, and also politically speaking. And when it comes to the military, many East Europeans and especially Ukrainians believe that German high-tech extends also to our military, but the opposite is true. So what you said about lack of ammunition, difficult procurement processes, is also very pertinent to what we have been experiencing with the German Bundeswehr over the last 20 years. So the idea that you can just, with a by snapping your fingers, deliver weaponry, and of course modern weaponry, to any place in the world is just very much disconnected from the reality of the German defense ecosystem. So I think that this gap between international expectations and domestic perspectives on foreign policy is an issue we will have to handle for some years to come, and that is also the task of the Chancellor, to patiently build up support for Germany's new foreign policy role in German society. And this might take longer than some of our friends might accept, but still, that, after all, it's a democracy. And for the first time, we are also experiencing the foreign domestic policy nexus, because in order to maintain our level of support for Ukraine, we will need to give some relief to our own population when it comes to the effects of rising energy prices. You know, in my constituency, people do not ask me when we will deliver Leopard tanks to Ukraine. They ask me about high gas and electricity prices, and how we could mitigate the effects of this on employment, on their bills, and so on. So that's just to explain why we feel we are really in a new era in Germany, and maybe more than other European countries which have some more experience with being in the first line of a major international conflict or even a war. The second point I would like to make this evening, since we are among Social Democrats, all the measures taken by the Scholz government following the Zeitenwende speech are completely within the philosophy of social democratic foreign policy. So we have adopted our policies, but we have not given up on our basic principles, because for 60 years now, more than 60 years now, the SPD and all the other major German political parties have been a pro-NATO, pro-EU, and pro-military political force. Before a very famous speech by Herbert Wehner in June 60, the SPD opposed NATO, opposed West German rearmament and the establishment of a West German army, and the SPD also opposed European integration. But from 1960 onwards, in every party platform, you will find a commitment to NATO, European integration, and to the Bundeswehr and the armed forces. And some of the most prominent, most successful, and most popular defense ministers came from the ranks of the SPD. So in the 70s, Weber; in the 90s in the 2000s, it was Peter Struck. So there's no doubt about that. But we sort of halved the heritage of Willy Brandt by just focusing on détente and disarmament. Although under Brandt's reign, we spent more than 3% of GDP on defense, and the defense budget was the largest budget of the West German federal government, larger than Social Security and labor. And it was Willy Brandt, our famous Willy Brandt, who introduced Tornado fighter planes in order to enable West Germany to have its part in nuclear sharing with NATO. And sometimes we as progressives have to look at the full potential of our political heritage, and not only of one side of it. And that's why I feel in full sync with Willy Brandt when I voted the 100 billion special fund for better equipping the German army and buying F-35 fighter planes and whatever you want. This is Willy Brandt policy. This is not, right-wing conservative politics. And this is a very important point because a new era should not mean that we give up our foreign policy principles, and the dialogue part of this dual track approach should not be forgotten, even with regard to Russia. So I believe that Russia is capable of becoming a democracy. There is no natural law that Russians are, by definition, incapable of democracy and rule of law. And whoever argues otherwise is a racist, because you boil down the Russian nation to some essentialist or culturalist features. And so, yes, for the time being, and probably for decades, there's not much room for dialogue with Russia. But we still have in our party platform the basic program of our party. We still have the idea of a pan-European security order, including Russia, and we will not scrap this, but we will have to wait some years for this to be realized and implemented. The last point I would like to make is about European security institutions. So I said the OSCE is weakened, is terribly weakened by Russia's policy. The NATO has come back to the fore of European security politics, which is fine. And the European Union has shown a strong sense of responsibility and unity by imposing a large set of sanctions, thus demonstrating that in non-military ways the European Union is a real superpower, because when it comes to the single market, wow, we have a lot of leverage and we can really impose things on other nations, on third parties, and I think that the Chinese have noticed well. And this is a very interesting building block for the future of a common EU foreign policy, to use this economic leverage, access to the single market, regulations in a much more forceful way. But at the same time, it has also shown that the UK, even under a conservative Brexit, ultra-Brexit government, re-engages with European security and is ready to get more involved with matters related to European security. And so I think that this should not be limited to one action because of circumstances arising from the war in Ukraine. We need to have a good working relationship, especially in security and foreign policy with Great Britain. It will differ from what we used to have with the EU membership, but as John rightly stressed, we have opportunities on a bilateral level between the UK and Germany, but there are also new opportunities between the UK and the EU, and for us as German foreign policy makers, it's very important to embed an enhanced bilateral relationship with the UK into a UK-EU relationship, because on some matters we will need EU involvement. And I think that we need to find ways, and very much depends to which extent a UK government is ready and willing to do that, how to bring together what we are doing with the strategic compass in the European Union and what the common security interests of the UK and the EU are. One evident case in point is defense cooperation. But I will also note that when it comes to value chains, to developing new technologies, the UK can play a vital role in that. And we have examples where UK companies play a almost irreplaceable role in providing some very specific technology. And when it comes to sanctions policy, for example, the expertise of the British authorities, because of London's extraordinary position as an international financial center, is also very important in order to really implement in a successful way a sanctions policy. So I think that except or besides collaboration with the NATO, which continues, there is room for having also some ties and some collaboration on specific issues with the UK on a bilateral and then on a EU basis. And I hope that we can explore this evening and in the future. Thanks.
Good. Thank you very much indeed. Really struck by many different messages, but a real alignment of values amongst everyone here. So we've got, I think, about 27 minutes for questions. And I was planning to take them in threes, if that's all right, and if we could keep them fairly punchy, just so we can get quite a few in, and then I'll return to the panel. If you'd be happy to introduce yourself before you ask, that would be brilliant. So.
Yeah, thank you very much. The name is Ewan Grant. I'm now a journalist and broadcaster on the current war. I did predict 60-40 chance that at the end of January that there would be a war from north and south, and I urge the TV viewers to read Tom Clancy's Command Authority and Commander-in-Chief, which are the first book I shoved across the table to EU delegation staff in Kiev in 2014. My question is for all of you, but particularly Mr. Schmid. How deep does the belief in the change needed in Germany go? How widespread is it among the Beamte, not just the politicians, but the Beamte, big business? Because frankly, the picture I saw, many Germans, not all of them by any means, when I worked in Ukraine for the EU, was very, very much darker.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Richard Reeve. I'm Rethinking Security. I was very interested to hear John Healey speaking about the integrated review refresh, which is happening at the moment. And I know that, John, I think you committed to a Labour defence and security review in the first year of government if you're in power. So with that in mind, I was wondering what perhaps you would learn from the German experience currently of developing a national security strategy. I think you're first, or indeed from the EU strategic compass. And to Mr. Schmid, if Germany is to increase its defence spending to 2% of GDP, it becomes the largest defence spender in Europe, unless UK and France increase spending to 2.7% or so of their GDP, which probably isn't going to happen. So I was wondering how comfortable Germany felt with taking that status in the future, rather than, say, parity with the UK and France.
Are there any other hands going up that I've not yet seen? Please, sir. Yeah.
These alumni at schools to Knowledge Institute of Studies. So you referred to a lot about the EU and its budgets, but underplaying somewhat NATO. You've been a member of Germany's been a member of NATO a very long time, and you can't ignore America. America is the biggest supplier, and the UK has been aligned with America more than it has with Europe, because America spends a lot more money. The problem for the UK is that the EU has not treated the UK particularly kindly while we were members, and that were rightly felt undervalued and pushed. And the negotiations for Brexit showed it immensely. France seems to be a leader of that. Will Germany take a stronger role if they wish to unite the United Kingdom in a closer role, working with Europe, to rein in what seems to be French-led attempts to undermine the UK's advantages, so that we can play a good role with our European friends?
Thank you. Is there anything in there that you wanted to pick up on, Kathy?
Well, that was quite an interesting statement about the relationship between the UK, France and Germany. And what I would just say to you is that having been in the heart of that, the collaboration that existed between the E3, as we called them, was extraordinary and continues to be extraordinary, actually, outside of the European Union. The E3 worked together on, for example, the Iran nuclear issue and continue to do so. And they're a strong group that would see themselves really at the centre of thinking in the context of the United States as well, that the US talks to Britain, France and Germany constantly. So I don't think it's right to position the French as the enemy and the potential of the Germans to be the friends. I think it's actually a much more complex and established relationship as a team. When I was at the European Union, the people I spoke to most of all were the Americans. I would speak to the Secretary of State a great deal because that was the ally. Back to my point about shared values and ideals. That was the ally, incredibly important, incredibly powerful. But if you simply look at the issue of Ukraine now, the context in which we think about Ukraine as Europeans, in the broadest sense Europeans, is different to the context in which the United States thinks about Ukraine. The implications and impact of sanctions from Europe on Russia are different, and the implications of what's happening by the Russian war on Ukraine to Europe are different, just in terms of energy alone. So we have a natural desire and need to have that strength of affinity and relationship, led often by the E3, that is different to the relation with America. Not at all to undermine it, not at all to see it as anything other than vital and important, but it's different.
Thank you. John?
Shall I pick up the middle question on the integrated review? First of all, it was welcome and good that the current government undertook that a couple of years ago. It's welcome and somewhat overdue that it's now being reviewed and refreshed. After all, it's a strategy, it needs to be updated. And it was quite clear because it failed to prepare or even foresee the risk of Putin launching an invasion of Ukraine. From February onwards, if nothing else, that required an update, and having argued for it since that time in the House of Commons and been told right until September that actually the integrated review proved, or rather Ukraine proved the integrated review right on all fronts. So that's welcome. We want them to get it right, really, this time. There are areas, some of which I've touched on, that I think there are flaws, there are contradictions, for instance, in a strategy that sees Britain's armed forces being persistently forward deployed around the world, and at the same time saying we're going to cut another 10,000 troops from the army, we're going to scrap entirely our heavy lift Hercules planes, which are playing such a big role in Ukraine. Oh, and by the way, there's no chance of us being able to provide a modern warfighting division to meet our NATO obligations until at least 2030. That's just, so there are some flaws that need to be fixed. I hope they do. The reason that even ahead of that, we've essentially made the decision and declaration that if we're able to get into government, then we'd need to undertake our own strategic defence review. It would have to reflect some of the values that we and leadership and our vision for the role of Britain in the world. But to the extent that they get this refresh right, there's less work for us to do. The other reason for doing it is, in the end, to link to your question about defence spending. When the first duty of any government is to defend the country, then any government must spend what's required to meet the threats. We did this when we were in government before, as Labour, after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. We brought in then the largest sustained increase in defence spending for 2 decades. And part of the fundamental asymmetry of opposition and government in the defence and security field is that all the access, essentially, to the assessments, the knowledge of what adversaries are up to, the capabilities that we have, and the costs are kept within government. And so it's very hard to make, particularly in defence, any sensible, well-based spending decisions without being able not just to open the books, as Rachel Reeves might say, but to undertake those assessments, ensure that we've got the briefings, we can make those sort of judgments for ourselves. So that would be part of our year one plan.
Thanks, John. Nils, there was a lot for you there.
Yeah, so I start with the question on European defence cooperation, because for us this is a crucial one. We believe that in the future European nations should pool their resources in order to produce less a smaller variety of tanks and fighter planes and helicopters to be more efficient. This, of course, is first of all a EU thing. But as you have seen during the debates around the shape of European defence cooperation, the German government is more open to invite third countries into this cooperation. So there was a debate, should the US be invited to join or not? And this also applies to the UK after Brexit. And even before Scholz took over, there was more openness on the German side than on the French side, to be very fair. And you've seen with Scholz's last proposal of creating a European air shield that he's very much open to non-EU member states and European NATO allies as like the UK, and I think the current government has already agreed to join. So I think we will find ways to include Great Britain on this. There are diverging industrial and business interests, of course, and we feel it very much in our bilateral cooperation with the French on the future air combat system. So yeah. And the French are pushing very hard for their interests, and okay, but this is the usual game going on. When it comes to the strength of the German army, you're right, there's widespread unease with the idea Germany becoming the major or the most important military power in Europe. And so I think it's not very wise, and it was not very wise from the Trump administration to lecture us on the 2% goal and on spending more on defense. I think our allies and friends should try another way of doing it by just saying, okay, we want you, we need you, and it's even more convincing when it comes from friends like Poland and the Baltic states. I think this is because much of the unease in the German debate on the military, on all matters military, is linked to the German past. And so it came as a surprise when Raphael Sikorski made his statement about fearing not a strong Germany, but a Germany too weak. And I think this is a better way of convincing the German population to spend more. And we can also come back to the experience of West Germany being a front nation in the Cold War, when the eastern flank of NATO was in Germany, in West Germany. And now the eastern flank of NATO moved farther east. But when I tell people about our engagement in Lithuania, I tell them, look, now we need to protect the eastern flank of NATO. Now it's in Lithuania and in other places, in Slovakia, where we do air policing and stuff like that. And I think this is much more palatable for a German audience. And then there's a second argument which is very important, especially on the left wing of the political spectrum, that is, spending more on defense does not mean a sort of arms race. It's just the basic thing we have to do to equip our armed forces well. So once you have a sort of obsolete fighter plane, you have to renew it. But that does not mean any escalation in terms of military technology. Of course, it's modern. It will be with drones and very complicated and electronic warfare, whatever you may add to that. But still, a country needs an army, and an army means you have frigates, you have tanks, you have fighter planes, you have artillery and ammunition. And we have to bring the debate back to the basics of armed forces. And that's why we do not talk about armament or rearmament. We talk about better equipping our armed forces, because that's much closer to the reality of the German Bundeswehr. And this finds a lot of support among my fellow MPs in the Social Democratic Party, but also in society. And now about the profound change. It's a profound change. I think there will be no return to business as usual with Russia. And you should not underestimate that this tidal change has started after 2014. It was too slow, with the benefit of hindsight, but doubts about the nature of the Russian government have been growing ever since Crimea was annexed. And now, with this brutal war of aggression and the war crimes occurring, it's so clear that with this regime there can be no return to doing gas deals and stuff like that. And there's one beneficial effect of the sanctions imposed after the Crimea annexation, that is that trade volume with Russia has tremendously decreased over the last 6 or 8 years. So the idea of Russia being a very important trade partner and a strategic partner for a sort of industrial modernization of the country does not hold any longer. It was, and is still, a very important raw materials provider: coal, steel, oil and gas. But in terms of our foreign trade, Russia has already lost much of its weight. And in political terms, of course, we understood, as I said, that a dialogue has come to an end, and we have to put more emphasis on the deterrent side of our relationship.
Thank you. Okay. Gosh, great. We've got 5 questions. So what I propose to do is take them all, but could we keep them quite punchy? And then we'll let people, in an equally punchy way, answer them because we've got that long left. And the woman just there, please.
Deborah Howard. I wanted to ask about Chancellor Scholz was the first Western leader to visit President Xi after his after the third-party contact. Could you talk a bit about that divergence between Germany and the US policy and why Britain?
Thank you. And the woman there, yes.
And Drzewski, I work to comment the Independent. I've got 2 half questions, one for Nils Schmid and one for Cathy Ashton. Would it have been easier for Germany if the arms supplies for Ukraine had been done in the name of NATO rather than on a bilateral basis? Because that puts the spotlight so much more on Germany. That's the first question. And the second one, Cathy, is a lot has been spoken about changing the ratio between dialogue and deterrence. Now, looking at the run-up to the war in Ukraine, it seemed to me that there was an awful lot of deterrence and really not much dialogue. The war seems to me to represent a colossal failure of deterrence. Could you comment on that?
Thank you. And yourself, sir?
Ollie Walsh from FTI Consulting. I'd just like to pick up on a few of the remarks that John made in opening and then ask a question for the whole panel. I completely agree with your diagnosis of the failures in MOD's procurement system. I think your 4 commitments on day 1 as Secretary of State, hopefully that's sooner rather than later, are the right ones, but I'm interested in how you potentially square the dichotomy between greater collaboration in Europe, in a procurement sense, with a build in Britain, buy in Britain sort of narrative. And then I guess for Nils, I'd be interested in what is your take on a policy of buy in Britain, build in Britain, and do you have an equivalent German kit for German troops? And if so, how do we bring those things together for the greater benefit of both the European and NATO collective security?
Thank you. Sir?
Thank you. Tony Carty, Professor of International Law at the Beijing Institute of Technology. The meeting is primarily about how Germany and Britain can come together and collaborate. And of course, having a common enemy will help a lot in any kind of collaboration. But following a little bit on from the lady's comments here, what role would cooperation between Germany and Britain play with respect to developing a common policy on how to bring this war to an end? I mean, otherwise, if one is constantly talking about how to strengthen our forces and prepare to resist the Russians, then one is really thinking of a war of attrition that can go on forever. What I have in mind is, I mean, there are different possibilities. One that is spoken about is that we let the Ukrainians decide, it's their country. Another possibility is that we insist that there has to be a total defeat of Russia and there has to be a military tribunal which puts the Russian leaders on trial for war crimes and crimes of aggression. And a third possibility, which of course is not very much on the table, is that the Russians have a point of view and that their Russian minority in the Ukraine has been badly handled, with the Minsk Accords not well implemented, and that some kind of compromise would be necessary. Now, I'm wondering whether would there be any discussion in this British-German collaboration, which I very much welcome. I did part of the time in London, part of the time in Berlin, part of the time in Beijing. I would welcome to thinking about what are the terms under which one could bring this conflict to an end, apart from having a nuclear holocaust.
Thank you. And last one, yourself.
Hi, I'm Adam Hug. I'm the outgoing director of the FBC and currently the leader of Westminster Council. Just to pick up on what John said about a commitment to a new, there's a Labour administration that we will have a another review, and obviously the government's review at the moment. John, what role do you see talking to people like Nils in the development of a Labour approach to a new review? Because if they're spending a lot more money on kit for themselves, and I think, how do you see other sort of relationship with our European partners about getting the right capability we need at a European level? Because Nils talked about Trump. You know, we don't have no idea about the long term. There are question marks still over the long term role of the US in NATO. So, what role does the panel see in terms of collaborating around sort of deepening and improving collaboration about what kit we need in, between the European pillars of NATO, given the Germans got on board putting an extra country?
Thanks. So in theory, we've got 3 minutes. I think we can probably take 8, if that's all right. I would ask people, panel members, just to maybe pick and choose a little bit so that we can get through those very interesting topics. Maybe if we flip it round, if that's all right, in terms of the order. Nils, are you happy to kick off?
Well, talking about defense industry, I think of all the major European countries, the defense industry in Germany plays the least significant role. So we do not have the idea of the defense industry being important for regional development in some places. We do not have big defense corporations that are solely focused on military equipment. So politically, in terms of political lobbying, the defense industry does not play such a role. So you do not have lender governments running up and down for their defense industry, because we have a huge manufacturing base. So, and then we have Deal or Rheinmetall, which have large civilian units and divisions, and Airbus is the same. So I think the idea of buy German is very, very strange to us. We want to have stronger European cooperation, and that means buy European, but for the years to come, our priority is to replenish our equipment and our arsenals, and we take off the shelf whatever we can find. Well, no Russian or Iranian or Chinese equipment, of course, but we buy American, we buy British. If you have ammunition, please hand it over. But I found some solace in the words John Healey had about the situation of the British defense forces. Okay. On China, I think there were huge misgivings and misunderstandings surrounding Scholz's visit to China. After all, he paid his inaugural visit to China as he did to other places all around the world. And there was a major departure from what Merkel did, because his first trip to the Indo-Pacific went not to China but to Japan. And his trip to China was embedded in a Southeast Asian tour, because he also he visited Singapore and Vietnam. And you had a German chancellor in his first year in office going to Japan, going to Singapore and Vietnam. You have never seen this before. And having intergovernmental consultations with India, not in India, that's why he did not go to India, but in Berlin, because it was Germany's turn to host it. So I think that should be the point you make about Scholz's visit to China. And it was the first German chancellor holding a press conference in Beijing and publicly denouncing human rights abuses in China. You have never seen this before, and I think we have not seen a British Prime Minister doing this in Beijing, nor a French president. So I think you should more focus on the new features of Scholz's approach to China and the Indo-Pacific, Then of the alleged continuities. Well, one thing that you cannot expect from Scholz is to have a confrontational attitude toward China. So he's more on the side of de-risking than decoupling, on the side of strengthening European sovereignty by building up our own capacities in new technologies like supercomputing, quantum computing, artificial intelligence and stuff like that, using the leverage the single market has, using European industrial policy to develop new markets and new technologies. But I think that the visit came at the right moment and sent the right messages.
Thank you. John?
I think we have a different imperative when we consider the case for building Britain. If it isn't a concern for the German public and the German economy, your defence purchase or your defence investment, whether it brings German jobs, I think it's more important to us. It's more important in the big picture for two reasons. The first is that I think it is part of building and maintaining a British public commitment to invest in our armed forces and our defences, which will become more important as we see the nature of how constrained the public finances are set to be. And the second is that it's quite clear that over the last 12 years our British growth record has been so poor, so pitiful, that it's created a complex of other problems, from poor investment in public services to the 70-year tax burden record. That economic growth in Britain is going to be an important part of what we need from a bigger government strategy. So when Labour is saying we want to, in general terms, buy, make and sell more in Britain, you've clearly got to look at 20 billion plus of annual defence investment and its role that it can play, which is great. So there's an imperative for us, I think, in the UK, which Nils isn't there for you in Germany. Ollie, how do you balance it? I think you start from you have a different starting point, which is there's got to be good reasons not to look, not just now, but how we build for 5 or 10 years' time, not to be looking to do something in Britain if we can. Take the latest contract that the government has let for 3 naval support ships. They could have been built in total in Britain, in British shipyards, instead of which the £1.6 billion contract for those 3 ships has gone to a Spanish company, in fact Spanish government owned. And so there is no calculation of the economic opportunities foregone in that as part of that decision, and that seems to me misguided and misjudged. Of course there are projects where either the scale or the technological innovation requires the sort of cooperation that you can't just do it in Britain, and that's required. Where you are looking to place some of the contracts, perhaps not first in Britain or with British companies, you really have to expect the British government to be driving a harder bargain. Take the contract for Ajax, the new armoured vehicles. Now, set aside any of the other aspects of this. The British taxpayers already spent £3 billion. The leverage that we've got from General Dynamics has been £40 million of General Dynamics investment that's gone into the operation that's there in South Wales and what we've managed to achieve so far. That's just not good enough. It's not a good deal. So it's failing the taxpayer. It's failing the British forces as well. Adam, on the European front, I I would really like to see, well, I think one of the frustrations and flaws for me of the current government's approach to NATO isn't just that there's, as David Hannay said to me before we started, a tilt to the Indo-Pacific means, or tilt towards something means a tilt away from something else. It isn't just that in relation to the overwhelming primary obligation to NATO. It is we've not spelt out what the British contribution needs to be over the next decade in NATO. What's the British role? And in my view, that should be Britain should ensure that we're the leading European nation in NATO. We can do a great deal more to accelerate, I think, the evident imperatives that are there. When you consider collectively, Western countries have donated 155mm artillery to Ukraine. There are 10 different types, none of which are compatible, none of which can fire the munitions that each. Then clearly, you've got not just a stockpile problem, you've got a standardisation and specification problem, and I would really like to see NATO being able, and reinforced by its leading members, to drive not just an initiative on stockpiles and European capacity to produce, but greater standardisation, more technological development, and I would want to see more mutual force development, much more close exercising. I hope we're going to get some of this through the NATO planning process that followed the Madrid strategic concept. It's not clear to me that we're helping drive that. We certainly should be, and that seems to me a proper role that the UK should play within NATO.
Thank you. Cathy, the last word.
So I'm going to just focus on your question about the failure of deterrence and also the point about bringing the war to an end. And I just take you back to the beginnings of the crisis in Ukraine. And I remember spending a lot of time in the Maidan demonstrations, talking with the president at that time, Yanukovych, and then later President Poroshenko, and with so many people in Ukraine who were looking for a future that allowed them to develop a stronger relationship with Europe. It was not necessarily either Europe or Russia, but a bit of both and, but done in a way that was sovereign to Ukraine, in the words that they would choose. A lot of dialogue in the 7 years of developing the agreement, the association agreement between Ukraine and the EU, took place that engaged Russia. We had, in those 7 years, 14 summits with Russia. I attended, in my time in office, 12 summits, and goodness knows how many other meetings with either President Putin or with his Foreign Minister Lavrov. So there would be many, many occasions during that period when conversation took place. I felt when I was in Ukraine just before COVID locked us all down, talking again about what more could be done to prevent what was fast becoming a frozen conflict, that a lot more needed to be done in both deterrence and dialogue, because we sometimes look at sanctions as the end. We do the sanctions, that's it, we've done it. It's not, it's a means to an end. And certainly over the years there's been an argument that we were not strong enough at the beginning in the first sanctions in order to try and upgrade the level of deterrence. But I think that President Putin miscalculated in three very particular ways. He thought Zelensky would run. He did not think he would stay. He thought that the European Union would be disunited and would not be able to put together strong sanctions against Russia and stick together, which it's pretty much managed to do. We'll see whether Viktor Orban manages to stay in the game, but hopefully he will. And he didn't think that the United States would be as strong as it was, because he had been listening not least to the previous president, who had, as you know, a very different relationship with Ukraine, a very different attitude to all of that. In terms of what goes forward, it must be for Ukraine to determine its future, and we can't take that away from it. We have to help Ukraine determine its future. And we have to avoid creating more frozen conflicts in Europe. We have Georgia, where the EU monitoring mission has been there for goodness knows how long, since 2008, I think. You have the challenges in Moldova with Transnistria. You have the potential, in the context of thinking about the security architecture of Europe, to start thinking about how we resolve these as well. And in doing that, it also plays into who is going to be important in those negotiations. And although we should not start thinking about negotiating now, we really do have to think about what the process will be in the end and who needs to be involved. Where will it be? Who sits around the table? Because we know from history, otherwise we will spend 2 years arguing about the shape of the table or who sits around it. You know, the Iran negotiations were quickly successful in terms of the new government in Iran because we had a process that had been running for 2 years with the Ahmadinejad government. The point is process matters. And in that context, and this is my final comment, don't forget China. Because in the broader context of how you resolve a conflict as important as this, there will need to be some thought given to who is going to give guarantees about what the role of the UN Security Council is, NATO is, the EU is, and so on. You will see Turkey pushing hard, I think, to be the convener and certainly the place where negotiations could happen, and that may be the right thing to do. But there may be many ways of looking at this in the sense of thinking about what it is that's going to be achieved, how far it's going to go, and what the context is going to be. So just think more broadly than Ukraine and Russia sitting in a room, because for sure that's not going to be what happens. But also more broadly, that when this is resolved, is this an opportunity to really seriously try and resolve relations across a broader spectrum? And my very, very final point is, I don't think this can be done with Putin, but I don't think we should identify Putin as Russia. Russia is an important country that in the decades to come, as Nils, you said, we've somehow got to find a way that on the European continent there can be something that is better than the current situation.
Very good. Thank you. That's been a terrific, really, really rich discussion. Huge thanks to Poppy, who pulled it together and organised it, and the Foreign Policy Centre. I'd like if people could give a really big round of applause to our speakers. That's been terrific. Roll the clock forward maybe 3 years, who knows. John may be here as Secretary of State. Nils will be here as a guest. Kathy will be here, of course. It'll be the start of the UK-German security partnership, bringing forward a new era in relations across Europe, and indeed grappling with those points just at the end about bringing forward a sort of safer continent, starting those conversations that Kathy was just referring to just now. You were here first. Thank you very much indeed. Safe journey home.